Tonight we're going to sit together in that gentle quietness, and we're going to think about reunions. The embrace on the platform, the letter that finally arrived, the knock on the door that changed everything back to how it was supposed to be. During the 1940s, families found themselves pulled apart, oceans between them, years stretching far longer than anyone had imagined or prepared for. But here's what I want you to hold gently in your mind as we begin tonight. Most of them found each other again. Most of those stories ended with togetherness. And all of them, every single one, have reached their conclusion now. Everyone involved has completed their journey. The waiting is over. Let these facts be like rain on a rooftop. Constant, soft, rhythmic. Let them blur together if they want to. Let your mind drift toward your own warm memories of homecoming, or simply float into the peaceful nothingness that sleep offers. There's only rest waiting for you. Patient and kind and completely yours. Fact 1. On the very first day of September 1939, the same morning Germany marched into Poland, Britain launched something called Operation Pied Piper. It was the largest organized movement of children in history, and it happened with remarkable speed. Within just 3 days, 1.5 million people had been moved out of British cities, most of them children traveling entirely without their parents. Each child carried a gas mask in a small cardboard box and wore a paper label around their neck with their name and destination written on it. Many of them had never been on a train before. Many had never spent a single night away from home. They were sent to villages and farms and quiet country towns, places considered safely distant from German bombs, and placed with host families who had agreed or been required to take them in. The separation was meant to be brief. A few weeks, perhaps. Maybe a couple of months at the most. In many cases it lasted 5 full years. Children who had left London at 6 years old returned at 11 or 12, having spent most of their remembered childhood far away from their parents. The emotional weight of that long gap was not immediately obvious. Children are adaptable, and they built new routines and new attachments in unfamiliar places, but the effect on family bonds was lasting and quietly complex, in ways that researchers are still gently documenting today. Fact 2. Not every evacuated British child arrived somewhere warm and welcoming. The government had recruited host families to take children in, but the system for checking on them was minimal and imperfect. Some children stepped off trains and into genuinely kind households, families who treated them like their own, who tucked them in at night and packed them lunches for school. Others found cold or indifferent homes, or worse, children from London's poorest neighborhoods sometimes arrived in middle-class rural houses and were met with a hostility born from class difference. They were considered dirty or badly spoken or somehow ungrateful. Some children were quietly used as household helpers, doing chores without acknowledgement or thanks. When parents at home received letters describing these situations, some made the painful decision to bring their children back to the city, even knowing the bombing had already begun. By January 1940, before the heavy bombing of the Blitz had even started, roughly 60% of evacuated children had already returned home, pulled back by homesick letters and worried mothers who simply couldn't bear the distance any longer. When the Blitz did begin in September 1940 and the bombs started falling on cities, a second evacuation had to be organized all over again. The same difficult goodbyes happened twice. The same children carried the same cardboard boxes to the same railway stations, and the same mothers stood on the same platforms watching them go again. Fact 3. For the mothers left behind in the cities, the separation carried a particular and sustained kind of worry that had no clean resolution. They received letters from their children when the letters actually arrived, and those letters were usually short, sometimes cheerful, sometimes clearly written under quiet distress between the lines of careful words. There was no telephone to reach for. A visit required train travel, and money, and time that working mothers often simply could not spare. Some parents went months without seeing their evacuated children at all, and when visits did finally happen, mothers sometimes arrived to find a child who seemed, in small, painful ways, to prefer the host family. A child who had picked up a new accent, new habits, a loyalty to a different set of routines. Arriving to find your child thriving in someone else's home was its own quiet devastation. It combined relief with a grief that had no clean name and no obvious place to put itself. An official study conducted after the war found that many women described the evacuation years as the loneliest period of their entire lives. The combination of absent children, absent husbands, and nightly bombing produced a compound isolation, several different kinds of loneliness all at once. That the ordinary pace of peacetime life was slow to heal, and that many women carried far longer than anyone around them ever knew. Fact 4. The Kindertransport was a separate and far more permanent form of family separation. Between December 1938 and September 1939, approximately 10,000 children, the great majority of them Jewish, were transported from Nazi-controlled Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia and Poland to Britain, where they were placed with foster families or in hostels and group homes. Their parents could not come with them. The scheme was open only to unaccompanied children, and the parents who put their sons and daughters on those trains understood exactly what they were doing. They were giving their children the best possible chance of surviving, and accepting in the same moment that doing so meant an indefinite and possibly permanent goodbye. For most of those children, the farewell on the platform was the last time they ever saw their parents. The majority of Kindertransport parents who remained in Europe were murdered in the Holocaust. After the war ended, many of the children, now young adults trying to build new lives, discovered this through Red Cross records or refugee tracing services. Often they received a single line on a card, a name, a camp, a date, a sentence confirming that the person they had last seen waving on a station platform had been deported and had not survived. That single line of administrative text was, for many of them, the only farewell their parents were ever given. Fact 5. The children who arrived in Britain through the Kindertransport found themselves in a situation that was difficult to describe and almost impossible to share. They had been saved, which meant they couldn't openly grieve everything else they had lost. They were in a country where most of them didn't speak the language, placed with strangers, expected to adapt quickly and be visibly grateful. Some were genuinely and warmly cared for, welcomed into families who loved them. Others found themselves in cold or indifferent households. But what almost all of them shared was a profound isolation, the impossibility of explaining what they had come from to people who had no way of imagining it. Some children pushed their memories down entirely and refused to speak of their families or their origins for decades. Some spoke cheerfully and continuously of normal things, building a surface life that covered everything underneath. The psychological literature on Kindertransport survivors describes patterns of difficulty with attachment, persistent survivor guilt, and a deep and lasting sense of not quite belonging anywhere that followed many of them through their entire adult lives. Their separation was not simply a matter of geography, it was the erasure of the world in which they had known who they were, and the construction of an entirely new self in a place where almost no one knew what had been lost to make that new self necessary. Fact 6. In Germany, millions of families were separated by conscription at a speed and scale that gave almost no time for adjustment or preparation. By 1939, Germany already had a standing army of more than 4.5 million men, and over the course of the war it would eventually mobilize more than 18 million. Fathers, brothers and sons left for the front sometimes within days of war being declared, receiving brief leave only at irregular and unpredictable intervals. Wives and mothers were left to manage households entirely alone, raising children, maintaining farms and businesses, handling finances and waiting. Letters were the primary connection between them, and the Wehrmacht postal service handled an extraordinary 40 million letters per week at the height of the war. But those letters were censored. They could take weeks to arrive or not arrive at all. Soldiers were forbidden from describing their location, their conditions, their health, or anything that might be militarily sensitive. Wives at home learned to read very carefully between the lines, listening to tone, noticing small details, passing the mood behind the careful words. When the letters stopped altogether, the waiting became something harder to name and harder to bear. A silence where a letter should have been was its own kind of message. and most of the women who received that silence understood exactly what it probably meant, even before any official word arrived. Fact 7. The Soviet Union's experience of wartime family separation was enormous in scale, and particularly brutal in how randomly and completely it scattered people from each other. When Germany launched its invasion on June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union mobilized approximately 34 million men over the course of the entire war, the largest military force ever assembled in history. Entire regions were overrun within weeks, cutting families off from each other not just by distance but by the front line itself, which moved fast and left no time for ordinary life to catch up with it. A family in Minsk or Kiev might have one member in the Red Army moving east, another caught under German occupation, and a third evacuated with a factory to somewhere deep in the Urals. These three people had no reliable way of communicating with each other, and often no knowledge of whether the others were even alive. Between 1941 and 1942, Soviet civilian evacuation moved approximately 17 million people eastward to escape the German advance. Entire factory workforces, entire research institutes, entire communities uprooted and sent east by train. The dislocation this caused to family units was immense. It broke apart households that had been intact for generations, scattered extended families across thousands of miles, and produced separations that were in many cases entirely permanent. People who lost each other in the movement and never found their way back to one another at all. Fact 8. Polish families suffered a form of wartime separation that was not accidental, but deliberately designed as a tool of control. Following the German and Soviet invasions of Poland in September 1939, the country was divided and its population subjected to systematic, organized displacement. The Soviet Union deported between 300,000 and 1 million Polish citizens to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and other remote regions in 4 major waves between 1940 and 1941. These people were loaded into cattle cars with almost no warning, sometimes an hour's notice, sometimes a single night to gather what they could carry. They were transported thousands of miles east in freezing conditions with minimal food and water. Families were often separated in the process itself, men taken to labor camps while women and children were sent to so-called special settlements in remote, barely habitable areas. Children were separated from parents at arrival points in the chaos of disembarkation. The Soviet system kept minimal records of these movements, and the disorder of transport meant that families split during deportation had almost no practical means of locating each other. Some of these separations persisted until the 1950s. Some were never resolved at all. People who lost track of family members in the cattle cars of 1940 and never received any word again. Not a letter, not a confirmation, not even the cold comfort of knowing what had eventually happened. Fact 9. For the approximately 400,000 British soldiers taken prisoner during the war, the separation from family was defined above everything else by uncertainty, a sustained, open-ended not knowing that had no predictable endpoint. A soldier reported as missing was not confirmed dead, but he was not confirmed alive either. His family existed in a kind of suspended state, receiving no pay, receiving almost no news, unable to grieve properly and unable to stop worrying. The Red Cross operated a postal service for prisoners in German camps, allowing them to send and receive a limited number of letters each month, typically 2 letters and 4 postcards. But these letters were censored before they left the camp, and they often arrived months late or not at all. Prisoners were not permitted to describe the conditions they were living in, the food, their health, or their actual state of mind. Many soldiers wrote letters that were deliberately and carefully cheerful, performing a kind of composure they did not feel, in order to protect the people at home from knowing how things really were. This meant the family had no accurate picture of what their husband or father was actually living through, day by day. They received instead a carefully constructed version of reassurance, written by a man who had learned, out of love, to lie gently on paper. Fact 10. Japanese prisoner of war camps imposed an almost total communications blackout on the Allied soldiers held inside them. The Japanese military did not consider itself bound by the Geneva Convention's provisions regarding prisoner contact with families, and the roughly 140,000 Allied soldiers held in Japanese camps were, in most cases, unable to send a single letter home for years at a time. Families found out about a soldier's capture, if they found out at all, through unofficial channels, a fellow soldier who had escaped, a message passed through a neutral country, a rumor that reached home through unexpected hands. British, Australian, and American governments kept lists of known prisoners, but those lists were incomplete and slow to update, and they gave families almost nothing to hold on to. Wives in Australia and Britain were left for years with nothing at all. No letters, no Red Cross confirmation that their husband was alive, only the initial notification that he had been taken prisoner somewhere on the other side of the world. Singapore, Bataan, a name on a map. After that, silence. Complete and unbroken silence, sometimes for 3.5 years, while the person who had sent that single notification sat in a camp thousands of miles away, and those at home woke each morning and went to sleep each night with no way of knowing whether he was still alive. Fact 11. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 created one of the most concentrated waves of family separation the Pacific War produced. Approximately 85,000 Allied troops surrendered to Japanese forces in what remains the largest surrender of British-led forces in military history. Most of those men were sent to Changi prison or to labor camps spread across Southeast Asia, including the notorious Burma-Thailand Railway. Their families in Britain and Australia received a brief official notification and then, in many cases, heard nothing further for months, sometimes years. Some wives with young children had been evacuating from Singapore themselves in the days and weeks just before the fall, leaving on ships while their husbands remained with their units. They arrived in Australia or India with their children and no word about what had become of the men they had just left behind. The combination of their own displacement and their husbands' imprisonment created a kind of double separation, two upheavals running simultaneously, that many of these women described in later life as the defining experience of the entire war. They were uprooted from their homes in one direction while their husbands were taken in another, and they spent years trying to hold the shape of their families together across a distance that felt, on many ordinary mornings, simply impossible to manage. Fact 12. Children whose fathers were away at war, whether serving in the military or held as prisoners, faced a specific kind of challenge that wasn't well understood at the time and received very little formal support. Many fathers had left when their children were infants or toddlers, barely old enough to have formed a real memory of them. A father who left in 1940 and returned in 1945 might sit down at the dinner table with a 6-year-old who had no memory of him at all, who regarded the tired man in the doorway with genuine weariness as they would any stranger. Some children clung tightly to their mothers and refused to acknowledge the returning man. Others were frightened by the sudden presence of unfamiliar adult authority in a household that had run without it for years. The adjustment was difficult for everyone. For fathers who had come through extreme experiences and returned carrying damage that had no name yet, and for children who had built a stable, functioning daily life around their mother alone and now had to rearrange everything to make room for someone they didn't know. Studies of this generation conducted decades later found lasting effects on their adult relationships, their approach to authority, and their capacity to form trusting bonds, quiet consequences of an absence that had shaped them before they had any language to describe it. Fact 13. Letters between separated families were the primary emotional lifeline of the entire war, and the postal systems that carried them were under extraordinary, sustained pressure. The British Royal Mail handled an estimated 25 million letters every single week during the war years. The United States Army Postal Service was delivering 38 million pieces of mail per week at its peak. Military mail was subject to censorship. Officers read soldiers' letters and cut or blacked out anything that mentioned location, troop numbers, morale, or operational detail. Soldiers learned to write around these restrictions over time, using coded references that their families would understand but a censor might not catch. A man who always mentioned watching the sun set over open water was probably in the Pacific. A mention of bitter cold placed him on the Eastern Front or in Northern Europe. The letters that survive from this period are remarkable human documents. intimate and careful, written by people who understood that every word would be read by a stranger before it reached the person they loved. They are disciplined and tender at the same time, shaped by restriction into a particular kind of precision. Ordinary people, factory workers, farmers, shopkeepers, finding exactly the right words because they had to, because the distance was so great and the paper in their hands was the only bridge across it. Fact 14. The displaced persons crisis that emerged at the end of the war in Europe was one of the largest forced dislocations in all of human history. By 1945, at least 40 million people across Europe had been displaced from their home countries, with approximately 11 million in Allied-occupied Germany alone. These included former concentration camp survivors, forced laborers brought to Germany from across occupied Europe, prisoners of war from multiple nations, refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet army, and people expelled from territories that had changed hands. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration established displaced persons camps across Germany and Austria to house and process these millions of people. Inside those camps, families searched for each other using notice boards covered in handwritten messages, through Red Cross tracing services, and through informal refugee networks where news passed person to person. Some reunions happened quickly. Within weeks of the war's end, people found each other against all odds. Others took years of patient, methodical searching, and some searches ended not with a living person but with a confirmation, a name on a transport list, a date, a camp name, the record of what had happened to someone, not the person themselves. The search gave people somewhere to put their hope while it lasted. When it ended, what remained was grief, but also for some the painful relief of finally knowing. Fact 15. The Red Cross Tracing Service, formerly known as the International Tracing Service, based in Arlesund, Germany, became the largest repository of records relating to wartime displacement and death that the world had ever seen. By the end of the war, it held documentation on approximately 17.5 million individual people. Families searching for missing members submitted inquiries that were carefully matched against those records. The process was slow and bureaucratic and often emotionally devastating. A reply confirming a death was still a reply, and the act of receiving it still required courage. But families sometimes waited years even for that. The International Tracing Service continued receiving and processing inquiries from survivors and their descendants for decades after the war ended. By the 1990s, nearly 50 years later, it was still handling approximately 300,000 inquiries every year. The sheer depth and permanence of the separation caused by the Holocaust and the war's displacement was such that the work of finding and confirming what had happened to people lasted well into the 21st century. Grandchildren were still writing to Arlesund in the 2000s, asking about grandparents they had never met, trying to find a name, a date, a trace of a person who had been erased from everything except the organization's quiet and meticulous records. Fact 16. French families faced a particular and painful form of wartime separation rooted in the armistice of June 1940. When France fell, approximately 1.5 million French soldiers were taken prisoner and transported to camps in Germany. They would remain there for 4 to 5 years, the entire duration of the war. Meanwhile, France itself was divided. The north came under German occupation, while the southern zone was administered by the Vichy government. Movement between the two zones was restricted, and eventually prohibited entirely. This meant that French families were dealing with two overlapping separations at once. They were separated from husbands and sons held in German camps, and they were sometimes also separated from each other by an internal border that had been drawn through the middle of their own country. A family whose members happened to be in different zones when the armistice was signed might find themselves unable to travel to each other for years. Letters between the zones were permitted but censored and unreliable. The internal division of France created a geography of separation that sat on top of an already fractured landscape. A country in which families had to navigate not just the absence of their people, but the dismantling of the ordinary geography that had always connected them, the roads and trains and simple freedoms of movement that peacetime had made invisible because no one had ever imagined them being taken away. Fact 17. German families in the final years of the war experienced a form of separation driven not by strategy, but by collapse. The gradual, then rapid disintegration of everything that had held ordinary life in place. As Allied bombing intensified from 1943 onward, German cities became increasingly dangerous for the people living in them, and the government organized waves of civilian evacuation, first children, then mothers with young children, then anyone who could leave the most vulnerable areas. Families who had held together through 4 years of war were now split. Children sent to relatives in the countryside or to children's homes in quieter regions. Mothers sometimes following and sometimes staying to keep households running or to continue working in war industries that had no one else to spare. By 1944 and 1945, as the Red Army advanced from the east and Allied armies pushed in from the west, the civilian population of entire regions was in mass flight, millions of people on roads, moving in any direction that felt safer than where they were. In that chaos, families lost contact with each other. Children were separated from parents during bombing raids. Groups were divided at river crossings, overwhelmed by panicking crowds. Some were not reunited for years. Some were never found at all. The collapse of Germany in those final months produced its own quiet archive of family separation, less organized and less documented than what came before, and therefore even harder to search through afterward. Fact 18. The expulsion of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe at the war's end was one of the largest forced migrations in human history, and it created one of the final great waves of wartime family separation. Between 1945 and 1950, an estimated 12 to 14 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia. These were communities that had lived in Eastern Europe for generations, centuries in some cases, and they were removed in a matter of years through processes that were frequently violent, chaotic, and entirely indifferent to individual family units. Men were often held back for forced labor while women and children were expelled and sent west without them. Groups were separated at checkpoints and redirected to different destinations with no coordination or record keeping. Elderly people were sometimes left behind entirely, unable to travel, unable to keep pace, separated from children and grandchildren who had no choice but to keep moving. Many of these separations were permanent. The person left behind died before they could be reached, or the political barriers that formed between East and West after 1947 made crossing back impossible. The extended family networks that had existed in these Eastern European communities for generations were dismantled within a few years, and the people expelled from them spent the rest of their lives in a country that was geographically Germany, but that felt in important ways like nowhere they had actually ever come from. Fact 19. For Japanese American families, the war's most painful separation was imposed not by an enemy, but by their own government. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 in February 1942, authorizing the forced relocation of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast to internment camps in remote inland locations. Families were given days, sometimes only hours, to arrange their affairs, dispose of property they had spent lifetimes building, and report for relocation. Some families with mixed heritage faced agonizing decisions about whether to stay together or separate. The camps themselves were uncomfortable, overcrowded, and psychologically oppressive. Surrounded by wire, supervised by guards, built hastily in desert and mountain locations far from any of the communities these families had built. But the deeper damage was the disruption to careers, property, and the social fabric of communities that had taken generations to construct. Men who were subsequently drafted from the internment camps to serve in the United States Army, and many served with extraordinary distinction in Europe, left families still imprisoned behind wire in the country they were being asked to fight for. The contradiction was not lost on anyone, and it shaped the lives and politics of Japanese American families for decades after the war had ended and the camps had been quietly closed. Fact 20. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part of any wartime separation, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was not a clean grief with a clear beginning and a predictable end. It was an open-ended suspension, a sustained not knowing, in which families did not know whether their missing person was alive or injured or captured or gone. A woman who had not received a letter in 6 months from a husband somewhere on the Eastern Front had no framework for understanding that silence. It might mean the postal service had been disrupted by the fighting. It might mean he was in a hospital and unable to write. It might mean he was dead and the notification simply had not found its way to her yet. Living inside that uncertainty for months and years produced a very specific psychological state. Vigilant, superstitious, unable to make plans, unable to grieve properly or feel relief properly. Suspended between two possibilities without the ability to choose either. Many women described maintaining a kind of internal clock, tracking how many weeks had passed since the last letter, calculating the odds quietly, bargaining with time in small private ways. When news finally came, of death or of survival, the response was often not what people had imagined it would be, because they had already lived through so many versions of both outcomes in their own minds, that the real one arrived into a space that had been worn smooth by waiting. Fact 21. When soldiers finally came home, the reunion was rarely as uncomplicated as anyone had imagined or hoped. Both people had spent years adapting to the other's absence. Wives had taken on new roles, new independence, new competencies that had come from necessity and stayed as genuine parts of who they now were. They had made decisions, managed money, raised children, and built a version of daily life that worked entirely without the person now standing at the door. Husbands returned having survived things they often could not, or would not, describe, carrying experiences that had no place in domestic conversation and that did not easily translate into the language of everyday life. The adjustment period after reunion was frequently turbulent and confusing for everyone involved. Divorce rates rose sharply in the years immediately following the war. In the United States, 1946 saw the highest divorce rate in the nation's history up to that point, at 4.3 per thousand. Some of those divorces reflected relationships that had simply not survived the years of distance. Others reflected something more complicated. Two people who had each independently become someone different, trying to live together again as though the years between had not changed either of them. The reunion was real. The love, often, was real. But the people who had loved each other in 1939 were not entirely the same people who stood facing each other in 1945, and the distance between who they had been and who they had become was not always possible to cross. Fact 22. Children in occupied territories faced a specific and devastating kind of family separation when parents were taken by the occupying authorities without warning. Across Nazi-occupied Europe, adults were arrested for political activity, for their Jewish identity, or simply as reprisal for acts of resistance elsewhere, often without any notice at all. A child who walked to school in the morning and returned in the afternoon to find a parent gone, arrested, deported, or shot in the street, was left in a state of total and unresolvable uncertainty. Extended family, neighbors, or community networks absorbed some of these children. Others ended up in institutions. Jewish children whose parents had been deported faced the additional weight of having to conceal their own identity in order to survive, living under false names in Catholic orphanages, or with non-Jewish families who kept their secret at considerable personal risk. These children could not grieve openly. They could not ask questions. They could not be who they actually were. The suppression of identity required for survival added a particular layer of psychological cost on top of the separation itself. Not just the loss of the parent, but the loss of the permission to acknowledge that loss, or to be seen as the person who had suffered it. Fact 23. Norwegian families experienced wartime separation shaped by the specific pressures of German occupation and by the deepening divisions the occupation created within communities and sometimes within families themselves. Approximately 50,000 Norwegians fled to neutral Sweden over the course of the war, often in small groups crossing mountain and forest in difficult conditions. Families were split along lines of resistance, one member actively working against the occupation, another attempting to stay neutral. a third making compromises with the occupying authorities. These political divisions within families produced separations that were not simply geographic but ideological and sometimes permanent. When liberation came in 1945 and the process of accounting for collaboration began, families in which different members had taken different sides faced impossible internal negotiations. Whether to protect someone who had made terrible choices, whether to stay silent or to speak, whether loyalty to family took precedence over every other obligation. Most chose silence. The fracture was not healed but sealed over, becoming private shame rather than anything that could be named and worked through openly. The children and grandchildren of those families inherited these suppressed divisions without ever being clearly told what they were inheriting, and the silence around them shaped those families for a very long time. Fact 24. Italian families experienced wartime separation complicated by their country's changing and deeply uncertain position in the conflict. When Italy surrendered to the Allies in September 1943, the country immediately became a battleground. German forces occupied the north and Allied forces advanced from the south, with the front line moving slowly upward through the peninsula for the next 2 years. Families were divided by that moving front line, some in Allied-controlled territory, others under German occupation, with limited or no ability to communicate across the divide. Italian soldiers who had been fighting across the Balkans, North Africa, and the Soviet Union were suddenly in an ambiguous position. Their government had surrendered, but the Germans had not. Hundreds of thousands were disarmed and imprisoned by German forces following the armistice. Approximately 650,000 Italian military internees were held in German camps, and their families in Italy had no reliable information about where they were or whether they were alive. The confusion of the armistice period, layered over the ongoing fighting that moved through the country for nearly 2 more years, produced a chaotic and prolonged period of family displacement that touched almost every household in Italy in some form before it was finally, slowly over. Fact 25. In the Pacific, families in the Philippines endured separation under Japanese occupation for more than 3 years. American and Filipino civilians, including entire families, were interned in camps such as Santo Tomas in Manila, where approximately 4,000 civilians were held from early 1942. Filipino families outside the camps lived under occupation, subject to curfews, severe food shortages, and the constant background threat of arbitrary violence. When American forces returned to Manila in February 1945, the battle for the city that followed killed approximately 100,000 Filipino civilians in a matter of weeks. Families who had survived 3 years of occupation and internment did not necessarily survive liberation. Some families who had managed to stay in contact through the occupation lost members in the final weeks of fighting that were supposed to bring them back together. The civilian internees at Santo Tomas were liberated on February 3, 1945, by American forces who arrived before the Japanese garrison had received or carried out orders to execute the prisoners. A margin of hours, perhaps less, that determined whether thousands of families would be reunited or would lose someone in the very last moment before rescue arrived. That particular narrowness, survival by hours, by chance, by the speed of a column of tanks, was something the survivors carried with them always. Fact 26. Letters written by separated families during the war constitute one of the most intimate historical archives of the entire 20th century. The tone of those letters was shaped by multiple pressures all at once: the need to reassure, the awareness of censorship, the desire for genuine connection, and the ever-present knowledge that a particular letter might turn out to be the last one ever written. Soldiers writing from the front often described the small sensory details of their immediate surroundings rather than anything larger: a cup of tea, a particular quality of evening light, a fellow soldier's joke. Because those small things were what they were actually permitted to describe, and also because those small things were what connected them to the civilian life they were trying to stay close to. Mothers writing to evacuated children kept their letters carefully calm, describing the garden, the neighbor's cat, what had been cooked for supper last night, preserving a version of normality that the child, far away in someone else's house, could hold on to. The studied, deliberate ordinariness of these letters was itself a form of emotional labor. Parents and soldiers choosing, consciously or not, to be steady on paper in order to provide steadiness to the person reading at the other end, even when being steady cost them something. Fact 27. The return of Soviet soldiers at the war's end was not the clean homecoming it was for soldiers in Western countries. Many Soviet soldiers were held in Soviet-run transit camps after the war for screening by the NKVD, the state security apparatus, before being permitted to return to their families. Soldiers who had been taken prisoner by the Germans were considered automatically suspect under Soviet military doctrine, which held that capture was a form of cowardice or, worse, potential treason. Some returning prisoners of war were sent directly from German camps to Soviet labor camps, without ever seeing their families. The liberation from one captivity leading immediately to another. Others were released, but placed under ongoing surveillance and restricted in their movements, unable to return to their home cities or to resume normal life. Families who had waited 5 or 6 years for a husband or father to come home sometimes received instead a quiet notification that he had been sentenced to additional years in a camp. The Soviet state's treatment of its own returning soldiers added a final and brutal layer to separations that had already lasted the length of the entire war. Men who had survived combat, captivity, and years of absence came home only to find that the state they had fought for regarded their survival as suspicious, and that the reunion their families had been waiting for was to be delayed, perhaps indefinitely, by the apparatus of a system that trusted no one. Fact 28. Chinese families endured the longest wartime separations of any major combatant nation. China had been at war since 1937, and in some border regions since the early 1930s, meaning that families in the most severely affected areas lived through 8, 10, or 12 consecutive years of conflict, spans of time long enough to define an entire generation. The Japanese occupation of eastern China displaced tens of millions of people, pushing them westward into the interior of the country. Families were split along the lines of flight, those who made it out to Chongqing or other interior cities, and those who did not, who remained behind in occupied Shanghai or Nanjing or 100 other places under Japanese control. Those who joined the Nationalist Army and those who joined communist forces found themselves not just separated from their families, but potentially on opposite sides of a political divide that was already forming beneath the surface of the anti-Japanese war. The civil war that resumed immediately after Japan's surrender in August 1945 extended these separations further, and the communist victory in 1949 and the division between mainland China and Taiwan created new political barriers that lasted for decades. For some Chinese families, the separation that began with the Japanese invasion in 1937 was not resolved until the 1980s, or later, or in some cases not at all. The war did not end cleanly in 1945 for China. It simply changed its shape and continued. Fact 29. The psychological impact of wartime separation on children became a subject of serious clinical research only after the war ended, driven largely by the work of a British psychiatrist named John Bowlby, who had begun observing evacuated children during the war itself. Bowlby's careful observation of children separated from their primary caregivers formed the foundation of what became known as attachment theory, the idea that a young child's early bond with a caregiver is not merely emotional, but foundational to their entire psychological development. His work demonstrated that even temporary separations, if they occurred at critical periods in a child's development, could produce effects on the child's ability to trust and to form relationships that lasted into adult life. The evacuated children of Britain, who numbered in the millions, were in a sense an inadvertent, large-scale, entirely unintended study in what separation does to human development. The clinical understanding that emerged from studying that generation changed how psychology and psychiatry thought about childhood, about bonding, about early experience, and about emotional resilience for the rest of the 20th century. What had been understood as a practical, even reasonable wartime measure, getting children out of the cities, turned out to have costs that nobody had anticipated and that took decades of careful, patient research to fully understand. Fact 30. Not all wartime separations ended in reunion. Across the millions of families displaced by the war, a substantial number simply never found each other again. The scale of death was such, an estimated 55 to 70 million people killed, the majority of them civilians, that many families had members who died anonymously, in unknown places, under circumstances that left no record that could ever be found. Families who spent years searching for a parent or sibling or child through the Red Cross or displaced persons services sometimes received a confirmation of death after years of patient inquiry. Others received nothing at all, no confirmation, no record, no grave. The person had simply disappeared into the machinery of the war and left no trace. Living with that particular absence, the absence of even confirmed grief, the impossibility of knowing which kind of loss you were supposed to be carrying, was one of the quieter and more enduring legacies of a war whose scale of destruction exceeded its capacity to record itself with any completeness. You cannot grieve cleanly what you cannot confirm. You cannot close a chapter that has no last page, and for a significant number of families across every country involved in the war, the chapter that began with someone walking out of the door in 1939 or 1941 or 1943 simply had no last page, only the absence where one should have been. Fact 31. Australian families faced their own particular geography of separation, defined by the vast distances between Australia and the theatres where Australian forces were fighting. Australian soldiers served in North Africa, the Middle East, Greece, Crete, New Guinea, and across the Pacific, all of them months away by ship from home. Letters took 6 to 8 weeks to arrive from the Middle East, longer still from the Pacific. When Japan entered the war in December 1941 and the threat to Australia itself became direct and immediate, Australian families experienced a new and specific form of dual anxiety, worry about sons and husbands fighting abroad, combined with genuine fear about the safety of the home country itself for the first time. The fall of Singapore in February 1942, with its 15,000 Australian prisoners, produced a concentrated wave of grief and uncertainty across Australia that lasted years. Many Australian families received no reliable news about a Singapore prisoner's condition until 1943 or later, after escaped or repatriated prisoners brought back first-hand accounts. Some received nothing until liberation in August 1945. 3.5 years of official silence, broken only by rumour and second-hand report, during which families maintained some form of daily life, without knowing whether the person at the centre of their worry was still alive to be worried about. Fact 32. Canadian families were separated across enormous distances by more than 1 million Canadians serving overseas during the war. Canada's military force was voluntary, which added a particular dimension to the separation. The men who went had, in most cases, actively chosen to go. Wives and parents at home knew this, and the knowledge was both a source of pride and a source of quiet and complicated feeling. Canadian forces served primarily in Britain and in northwestern Europe. Many soldiers spent years in Britain before seeing any significant combat, training, waiting, living in a country that was not theirs, in a war that had not yet required them directly. During those years, letters home described England, boredom, the weather, small incidents of garrison life, not the things that families had steeled themselves to hear about. The waiting on the Canadian home front during those years was a specific kind, not the acute fear of a loved one in immediate danger, but the dull, sustained uncertainty of an open-ended absence with no clear resolution date. The Canadian military established regular pay allotments sent directly to wives, providing a measure of practical support. But the financial structure could not address the emotional reality of two people living completely separate lives, accumulating completely separate experiences, and slowly, quietly, becoming people the other would have to relearn. Fact 33. The women who remained at home during the war were separated not just from their husbands, but from an entire social structure that had been built around the assumption of their presence. The men who left took with them more than their physical presence. They took the economic arrangements, the social positioning, the shared domestic authority that had organized those women's lives. Women managing entirely alone had to negotiate with landlords, employers, government agencies, and community institutions that had been designed around male-headed households and that were often slow to acknowledge the new reality. Many women managed this with remarkable competence and quiet resilience, but the experience also transformed them, gave them capabilities and confidence and a kind of independent agency that they had not had before the war, and that did not simply evaporate when their husbands eventually returned. The returning husband often walked back into a household that had been functioning efficiently without him, run by a woman who had spent years making every decision alone. That shift in domestic reality was one of the quieter but more durable consequences of the war's separations, something that was rarely named or discussed directly, but that shaped the texture of marriages and households across an entire generation, long after the war that had caused it was officially over. Fact 34. Dutch Jewish families experienced a separation so complete and so rapid that its full extent was not understood until after the war revealed what had been happening. In May 1940, when Germany occupied the Netherlands, the Dutch Jewish community numbered approximately 140,000 people, a well-integrated, long-established community in a country known historically for its tolerance and openness. Within 2 years, the systematic deportation of Dutch Jews had begun, and by late 1943 the vast majority had been deported to camps in the East. The Dutch deportation rate, approximately 75% of the Jewish population killed, was among the highest in all of Western Europe. This was partly because the Dutch administrative infrastructure was efficient and its records complete, and partly because the flat, densely populated geography of the country made hiding extremely difficult. Families who attempted to go into hiding were entirely dependent on non-Jewish neighbors for their survival, and the separation between those in hiding and the world outside was total. Children who went into hiding, like Anne Frank, entered a world of complete concealment, silent during the day, unable to be seen from the street, cut off from school, from friends, from the ordinary texture of childhood, and emerged, years later, into a world in which their entire social network had been destroyed. Fact 35. The process of family reunion after the war was often deeply disorienting for everyone involved, far more so than most people had anticipated or prepared for. Children who had been evacuated or hidden or simply raised in their mothers' households during 5 years of conflict had grown up with one parent effectively absent for most of their conscious childhood. They returned to, or were returned to, family configurations that no longer matched what they remembered. In Britain, children who came back from evacuation in 1945 came home to parents they had not seen for years, to siblings born in their absence, sometimes to streets or neighborhoods they barely recognized because bombing had changed the landscape around them. The physical act of coming home was only the first step in a much longer and less visible process of emotional reconnection that no one had provided any framework for navigating. For many families, particularly those where the returning soldier came home carrying trauma that had no name yet and no treatment, that process of reconnection was never fully completed. The war ended on a date that everyone could point to. The separation and its effects did not end on that date. They continued, quietly and without ceremony, for years and in some cases decades, running beneath the surface of lives that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. Fact 36. One of the less-known categories of wartime family separation was the kind caused by civilian internment within Britain itself. When Italy declared war on Britain in June 1940, the British government immediately interned approximately 19,000 Italian civilians living in the country, most of them long-established residents who had lived and worked in Britain for decades. These were cafe owners, restaurant workers, ice cream vendors, tradespeople, people who had built their lives in British communities and whose children had been born there. They were interned on the Isle of Man or transported to Canada and Australia. Their British-born wives and children were left behind, separated from husbands who had committed no offense beyond the accident of their national origin. The internment of German and Austrian nationals created the same troubling paradox. Many of those interned were Jewish refugees, who had already fled Nazi persecution, people who were the victims of Hitler's Germany, now imprisoned by Britain as potential enemies of Britain. Their families, many of them also refugees who had arrived with almost nothing, could not reach them. The separation was bureaucratic and arbitrary, and, in many cases, deeply absurd. A system for managing wartime security that caught in its net exactly the people who had the most reason to want Britain to win. Fact 37. Greek families under Axis occupation endured separations driven by a devastating combination of military presence, resistance activity, and one of the worst famines in European wartime history. The famine of 1941 to 1942, caused by Axis food requisitioning and a British naval blockade of occupied ports, killed between 100,000 and 300,000 Greek civilians, the majority of them in Athens and the surrounding urban areas. Families who had been intact when the occupation began lost members to starvation over periods of months, a form of death so gradual and so pervasive that it reshaped the entire social landscape of urban Greek life. Men who joined the resistance, which was proportionally the largest in occupied Europe, lived in the mountains or the hills, and were effectively absent from their families for years. Their wives and children in occupied cities had no reliable contact with them, and no knowledge of their safety from day to day. When resistance fighters were caught, they were frequently executed in public reprisal killings. Families in the cities therefore lived with the knowledge that a husband or son who hadn't written in weeks might be dead without any formal notification ever arriving, that the silence might simply be the silence, with nothing coming after it. Fact 38. For families separated by the Holocaust, the post-war reunions that did occur were often as psychologically complex as the separations themselves had been. Survivors who returned to their hometowns in Poland, Hungary, or the Baltic states often found their houses occupied by strangers, their communities entirely gone, and sometimes hostility from local populations who had benefited materially from the dispossession of Jewish families. Those who found a surviving relative, a sibling who had emigrated before the war, a cousin who had been in a different camp, a friend who had taken a different road, sometimes described the reunion as the moment when they could finally allow themselves to understand the full weight of what had happened. Before that, survival had required a kind of internal suspension, not thinking too completely about what was gone, because thinking completely about it was not compatible with continuing, but meeting someone who shared the same before, who knew the same streets, the same family, the same ordinary life that existed before the deportations, broke open something that had been held closed, and the grief that came through was enormous, necessary, and very slow to settle. Fact 39. The children born to separated couples during the brief periods of leave soldiers received, or to relationships formed in the chaos of wartime displacement, grew up in a particular kind of uncertainty about who they were and where they came from. Fathers who had met a child for 2 weeks on leave and then returned to the front were strangers to that child by the time they came home. Some never came home at all, leaving children who grew up with a photograph and a handful of stories as the entirety of their father's presence. In Britain, approximately 70,000 children were born to American GIs and British mothers during the war, sometimes within marriages, very often not. When American forces withdrew after the war, many of those fathers left and did not return, leaving children who were American citizens by birth but entirely British in every practical sense, raised by single mothers navigating considerable social stigma without support or acknowledgement. The question of identity, who their father was, what nationality they actually belonged to, what their history was, followed these children into adulthood, and in many cases remained unresolved for their entire lives, a small, personal echo of the larger dislocation the war had set in motion. Fact 40. The war's end did not arrive cleanly for all separated families. In some cases, the news of peace created a new and particular form of uncertainty rather than resolving the old one. Families who had spent years not knowing whether a husband was alive now knew that, if he was alive, he should be returning. But the process of demobilization was slow and carefully phased, and men were not released from military service all at once. British demobilization was spread across 1945 and 1946, prioritizing men by age and length of service. A woman whose husband had been among the first conscripted might find herself waiting until well into 1946 for his return. Months after the war had officially ended, months after the celebrations had been celebrated and the world had begun, publicly, to move on. The gap between the war's end and the actual physical reunion was its own particular kind of suspension. Not the anguished uncertainty of not knowing, but the impatient, edgy tension of knowing and still waiting. For many families, that final stretch, peace declared and reunion theoretically imminent but still not here, was described as almost harder to bear than the years of genuine uncertainty that had preceded it. The waiting, it turned out, did not simply stop when the war did. Fact 41. The long separations of the war left a generational imprint on the children who lived through them that is only fully visible in retrospect, from a distance. The cohort of children born between approximately 1933 and 1940, old enough to remember the separation clearly, young enough to be profoundly and lastingly shaped by it, grew up to become the parents of the baby boom generation. They raised their own children with approaches to attachment, to stability, to the importance of keeping families physically together that were directly shaped by what they themselves had experienced. Many placed an almost fierce value on geographic rootedness, on not leaving, on keeping the family in one place. Others, quietly traumatized by the unpredictability of their own childhoods, struggled to form secure family bonds. The second and third order effects of wartime family separation, expressed in parenting styles, in psychological patterns, in value systems and domestic priorities, rippled through subsequent generations before gradually, very slowly, dissipating. The war ended in 1945. Its effects on how families understood themselves, what they feared, and what they worked hardest to protect continued for decades afterward, carried forward by people who had been children during the separation and who, without always understanding why, organized their adult lives around the determination that it would not happen again. Fact 42. Among the most quietly heartbreaking documents of wartime family separation are the diaries kept by children, in hiding, in evacuation, in occupied cities, in camps. The most famous is Anne Frank's diary, kept between 1942 and 1944, while she and her family hid in a concealed annex in Amsterdam. But Anne Frank was one of many thousands of children who wrote during those years, using writing as the only available way to process experiences that had no other outlet and no one safe enough to share them with. These diaries record the texture of separation and fear with extraordinary precision. The boredom alongside the terror, the fierce attachment to small objects that connected the writer to a normal life that now existed only in memory, the careful tracking of time passing, the writing addressed to an imagined future reader in whom all hope for witnessing was quietly invested. They are also records of voices that were mostly silenced by the war. Anne Frank did not survive, and neither did the majority of Jewish children who kept diaries during the occupation years. What remains are their words, written in the present tense, addressed to a future they did not live to see, still arriving, all these years later, exactly as they were sent. Fact 43. The stories of families who managed to stay together through the war reveal, in their details, exactly what that required. Families who remained intact often did so through a combination of luck, geography, and deliberate strategic choices, the decision to leave rather than wait, to hide rather than register, to keep moving rather than risk staying. Jewish families who survived the Holocaust relatively intact, and there were some, often survived because one member had had the foresight, the resources, or the desperation to get the family out before the deportations began in earnest. Non-Jewish families in occupied territories who stayed together often did so by maintaining political invisibility, staying away from resistance activity, avoiding the attention of occupation authorities, accepting a contraction of their lives and their values as the price of remaining physically present for each other. The cost of that strategy was sometimes its own form of separation, a withdrawal from community, from conviction, from the version of themselves they had been before the occupation began. Survival preserved the family unit while quietly altering the people inside it, and some of those alterations took years to become visible and longer still to understand. Fact 44. The Soviet-Finnish War of 1939 to 1940, known as the Winter War, produced a form of family separation specific to Finland's geography and to the particular stakes of a small country fighting an enormous neighbor. When the Soviet Union attacked Finland in November 1939, the Finnish military mobilized the vast majority of its adult male population, leaving behind a society of women, children, and the elderly managing in extreme winter conditions, with the front line moving rapidly. Finnish families additionally faced the evacuation of the entire Karelian region. Approximately 430,000 Finnish citizens, roughly 12% of the country's population, were moved westward as Soviet forces advanced. These evacuees lost not just their homes but their entire communities in the displacement. The church, the neighbors, the familiar landscape, everything that had made daily life legible. Finnish families were split between evacuated relatives and husbands and sons at the front, managing across distances that were difficult in any season and very hard indeed in a Finnish winter. When the war ended and the peace treaty was signed, the Karelian territories remained Soviet. The evacuees could not go home. What had been presented as a temporary displacement became permanent, and the loss of home was added irreversibly to the other losses of the war. Fact 45. The International Red Cross's role in maintaining contact between separated families was one of the most significant humanitarian operations of the war, and its scale was extraordinary. The ICRC in Geneva coordinated the exchange of prisoner-of-war information between countries at war with each other, operated a postal service for prisoners that allowed them to send and receive letters, and maintained a central tracing agency that handled inquiries from families searching for missing members. By the end of the war, the ICRC had registered information on approximately 250,000 prisoner-of-war camps and civilian internment facilities. It had handled over 120 million pieces of mail for prisoners. It had transmitted 24 million individual messages between prisoners and the families waiting for them. The organization was constrained in significant ways. The Japanese military refused to cooperate with its conventions, and the Soviet Union managed its own prisoner information opaquely and without external oversight. But in the theaters where it could operate, primarily Western and Central Europe, the Red Cross was, for millions of families, the only thread connecting them across the borders of war, the only institution whose sole purpose was to ensure that people who had been separated could know that the other person was still there. Fact 46. Families separated in Europe at the war's end faced the additional complication that the continent they were trying to find each other in had been redrawn. Borders had moved, countries had changed names, populations had been expelled from territories that now belonged to different states. A Polish family whose home was in the Eastern Territories found that those territories were now part of the Soviet Union and could not simply be returned to. A German family from Silesia found that Silesia was now part of Poland and that the house they had always called home was now someone else's house in a different country. Family members who had been scattered by the war's movements might be in 3 different occupation zones, one in the Soviet zone, one in the American zone, one in a displaced persons camp in the British zone, with movement between those zones restricted by political agreements that placed administrative order above individual human need. The political geography of the post-war settlement made family reunion not just emotionally and practically difficult, but in some cases structurally impossible. And for families divided by the Iron Curtain that descended across Europe by 1947, the separation continued not just for the duration of the war, but for the duration of a geopolitical order that lasted in some cases until 1989. Fact 47. Children who stayed in the city with their mothers during the war grew up inside a carefully managed version of fear, one that their mothers worked very hard to construct and maintain. Those mothers kept routines going through everything: school, mealtimes, bedtime, even when the sirens had kept the whole household awake through the night. Many of these children described their wartime childhood as intensely vivid rather than traumatic, partly because their mothers worked so hard to normalize what was happening around them. The absent father existed in the household as a presence built from paper and memory, his photograph on the mantelpiece, his handwriting recognized before the envelope was opened, his name spoken carefully at the dinner table. Children in these households developed, early in life, a particular understanding of absence, that someone could be deeply central to a family's daily emotional world while being physically nowhere near it. They absorbed, without being directly told. The specific texture of waiting, the way a mother's posture changed when the post arrived, the breath held before a letter was unfolded, the quality of relief or quiet tension in the moments that followed. These children grew up understanding that love and distance were not opposites, and that a family could hold itself together around an empty chair for years if it had to. Fact 48. For many families, the hardest part of wartime separation was not how long it lasted, but how it began. Without time to prepare, without warning, without the chance to say what needed to be said. A British soldier conscripted in September 1939 might have had a few days to say goodbye. A French soldier caught in the rapid German advance of May 1940 might have had hours. A Soviet civilian caught behind German lines in June 1941 might have had no warning at all. One morning life was ordinary, and by afternoon the roads were full of soldiers moving in the wrong direction, and there was no more time for anything. That abruptness meant there were conversations that never happened, arrangements that were never made, farewells that were too hurried to feel final. There were last ordinary meals together that neither person knew were the last. Many families carried that incompleteness for the rest of their lives. The thing that was left unsaid, the goodbye that didn't have enough space around it to mean what a goodbye should mean. Survivors of these sudden separations often said that what stayed with them most was not the years of absence that followed, but that first moment of realizing the person was gone before they had properly left. Fact 49. Soldiers on the Eastern Front faced one of the most extreme communication gaps of the entire war. During the major German offensives of 1941 and 1942, army groups moved hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, making postal delivery nearly impossible to coordinate. Letters from home could take 2 months to catch up with a unit that had advanced deep into Soviet territory. By the time a soldier received a letter written by his wife in August, it was October, and the world described in that letter, the garden, the neighbors, what the children had done at school, felt like a transmission from another reality entirely. The emotional gap this created was significant, and for many soldiers grew over time into something that felt insurmountable. Soldiers described feeling as though they existed in a parallel world that had no real relationship to the domestic life their families were still living. Some stopped writing, not from indifference, but because the distance between the two worlds had become too wide to bridge in a single page. Others wrote constantly, using the act of correspondence as a way of reaching back toward a life they feared was slipping away from them, holding on through words because there was no other way to hold on at all. Both were attempts to manage the same unbridgeable distance. Neither entirely worked. Fact 50. Children evacuated from British cities were not always given the full truth about why they were being sent away, or how long they would be gone. Parents trying to manage their children's fear often framed evacuation as something light, an adventure, a chance to see the countryside, a temporary visit with nice people who had a farm. Some children genuinely believed they would be home within a few weeks. When weeks became months, and months stretched toward years, the gap between what they had been told and what was actually happening created a quiet but lasting confusion. Some evacuees discovered the full scale of what had been happening in the cities they had left. The bombing, the casualties, the nights sheltering underground, only as adults, years later, and felt a strange delayed fear on behalf of parents who had been living through it while writing cheerful letters. Others described feeling obscurely deceived, not because their parents had lied with bad intent, but because the protection had been so thorough that the child had been left without the means to understand their own experience accurately. The gap between the managed version of events and the real one was something many evacuees spent years quietly, gently trying to close. Fact 51. Dutch families in the winter of 1944 to 1945 experienced a separation made uniquely anguishing by the knowledge that relatives on the other side of the front line were starving and that there was absolutely nothing that could be done to reach them. The Western Netherlands remained under German occupation, while the South had been liberated. A German embargo, imposed after a Dutch railway strike in support of the Allied advance, cut off food supplies to the occupied West entirely. Civilians in Amsterdam and The Hague were surviving on around 400 calories per day by February 1945, roughly a fifth of what a human body needs to function. People ate tulip bulbs, they boiled leather, Around 20,000 civilians died of starvation that winter. Families in the liberated South knew this was happening and could do nothing. They could not cross the front line to bring food. They could not reach separated relatives by post or phone. They waited through the months of that winter with the specific and terrible anguish of knowing that someone they loved was suffering and being entirely unable to reach them. When liberation finally came in May 1945, and the front line dissolved and families crossed it looking for each other, some found relatives changed beyond easy recognition, hollow-faced and quiet in ways that took months to fully understand. Fact 52. When fathers finally came home, the reunion was rarely the uncomplicated joy that the photographs from that period suggest. Children who had grown up without a father present had no working template for what that relationship was supposed to feel like or what it asked of them. They had built their understanding of family around whoever had actually been there. Usually the mother, sometimes a grandparent, sometimes an older sibling who had taken on quiet authority in the absence. The returning father stepped into a household that had organized itself entirely and successfully without him, and his attempts to reassert parental authority were often met with confusion, or with a polite but genuine resistance from children who simply did not know him well enough to follow his lead instinctively. Many returned fathers described feeling like guests in their own homes, welcomed, even loved, but not integrated into the daily rhythms that had formed without them. The intimacy of parenthood, it turned out, was not something that could be held in suspension across years of absence. It had to be rebuilt, slowly and carefully, through the accumulation of ordinary shared moments, from almost nothing. Some fathers managed this with patience and grace, others found the distance too wide to close in the time available, and the relationship with their children never fully recovered the ground that the years had quietly taken. Fact 53. The British Indian Army was the largest all-volunteer military force in history, eventually numbering over 2.5 million men drawn from across the subcontinent. Soldiers who served in North Africa, Italy, Burma, and the Middle East, thousands of miles from villages where their families had no reliable means of following what was happening. Letters arrived irregularly, and were of limited use in communities with partial literacy. Pay allotments reached families through a bureaucratic system that was slow and inconsistent. Meanwhile, the Bengal famine of 1943 killed an estimated 2 to 3 million people in eastern India, many of them from communities that had men serving overseas. These soldiers were far away fighting for an empire that was simultaneously allowing their families to die of starvation at home. The fact was not lost on the soldiers themselves, and it shaped the politics of the post-war years and the Indian independence movement profoundly. Families dealt simultaneously with the absence of men at war and the deaths of relatives from famine. Two kinds of loss running in parallel, one distant and uncertain, one immediate and devastating, neither cancelling out the weight of the other. What these families were asked to endure in those years, and how little acknowledgement they received for enduring it, is one of the quieter and larger omissions in the way the war has been remembered. Fact 54. One of the most overlooked categories of wartime family separation was the kind caused by ideology rather than distance. The fractures that opened up within families when different members found themselves on different sides of the same war. Across occupied Europe, families in which one member had joined the resistance and another had collaborated with the occupation were, in a very concrete sense, in opposition, potentially working against each other without knowing it. A French family in which one son had joined the Vichy militia and another had joined the resistance was divided by a line that went straight through the middle of a shared table and a shared history. When liberation came and the post-war accounting began, these families faced impossible internal choices, whether to protect someone whose choices had been indefensible, whether to stay silent or speak, whether the obligation of blood loyalty took precedence over the obligations of justice. Most chose silence. The fracture was not healed but sealed over, treated as private shame rather than as something that could be named and worked through with any honesty. These suppressions were common across France, Belgium, Norway, and the Netherlands, and the silence around them lasted for decades, shaping family dynamics that the children and grandchildren inherited without ever being told quite why. Fact 55. Yugoslav families faced perhaps the most deeply layered web of wartime separation in all of Europe. Yugoslavia was invaded and dismembered in April 1941, divided between German, Italian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian occupation zones. Within that fractured territory, multiple resistance movements fought the occupiers and each other simultaneously, along ethnic, religious, and ideological lines that had deep roots and no clean resolution. A single family might have one member in the Ustasha militia, one fighting with the communist partisans, one in hiding, and one already deported. All at the same time, all during the same war, all within the same collapsed country. The conflict in Yugoslavia killed approximately 1 million people, roughly a tenth of the pre-war population, and the separations it produced were layered over pre-existing divisions that made reunion, even when it was physically possible, emotionally and politically fraught. The communist government that took power after the war actively suppressed open discussion of what had happened within and between families during the occupation, treating the complexity of it as a threat to the national unity it was trying to build. Families carried their unresolved histories privately for decades, passing fragments of them to children who often had no context for what they were receiving and no invitation to ask. Fact 56. The letters that soldiers wrote home served a purpose beyond communication. They were also a form of emotional regulation for the people writing them. Research on wartime correspondence consistently shows that soldiers used the act of writing to step temporarily outside the military context and back into their civilian identity, husband, son, father, the person they had been before the war, and hoped to be again after it. Writing to a wife or parent was a way of insisting to themselves that that life still existed and was still worth surviving for. Many soldiers described it as the most stabilizing thing they did all week. The letters were also written in many cases with extraordinary care. Men who had left school at 14, who had spent their lives in factories or on farms, produced pages of real emotional precision, shaped by the need to say something true within the constraints of censorship and distance, and by the knowledge that the person reading it was frightened and needed both honesty and reassurance simultaneously. The tension between those two demands, be real, be comforting, produced a particular kind of writing that was disciplined and intimate at the same time, and that constitutes one of the most purely human archives the war left behind. Ordinary people, finding exactly the right words under impossible conditions. Fact 57. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, approximately 11 million displaced people were present in German territory alone. Former forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war, and refugees from every direction. UNR established displaced persons camps across the occupation zones, and inside those camps, families attempted to find each other in conditions of enormous and sustained chaos. Notice boards were covered in handwritten messages, names, last known locations, contact details for wherever a person was now sleeping. People walked between camps asking for news of specific individuals. The Red Cross Tracing Service received millions of inquiries in the months following liberation. Some reunions happened within weeks. People found each other against all odds, in the right camp at the right moment, recognized across a crowded room. Others took years of patient searching, and many searches ended not with a living person but with a confirmation, a name on a transport manifest, a date of arrival at a camp, a date after which there was no further record. The search had given people somewhere to put their hope while it lasted. When the hope ended, what remained was grief, but for some also a painful and necessary relief at finally knowing which kind of loss this was. Fact 58. The Kindertransport children who survived the war faced an identity reckoning unlike almost anything their British peers experienced. They had been saved specifically by leaving, by the decision of parents who put them on trains to a country whose language they did not speak, into the care of strangers who were entirely unknown to them. Their parents had mostly been killed after staying behind. The entire logic of their survival was rooted in that final goodbye on a platform, and that goodbye had determined everything that followed. The foster family, the new language, the new name in some cases, the gradual absorption into British life. Many carried all of this quietly for decades, saying very little about where they had come from. When the Kindertransport generation began speaking publicly in the 1980s and 1990s, What emerged was not simply historical testimony but the long-delayed processing of a separation that had never been allowed to be fully grieved. These were people in their 50s and 60s finally saying out loud, for the first time, what the 7-year-old or 10-year-old on the platform had felt, that being saved and losing everything were not two separate experiences. They were the same experience. They had always been the same experience. It had just taken 50 years to find the space and the language to say so. Fact 59. African soldiers separated from their families by service in British and French colonial forces have received relatively little historical attention, but their numbers were significant and their experience was distinctive. Over 500,000 Africans served in Allied forces during the war, fighting in North Africa, East Africa, Burma, and Madagascar. These men left villages and communities in which they were central economic and social figures, and their absence reshaped family structures and community life for the entire duration. They returned, those who did, to communities that had managed without them, and sometimes to a changed sense of their own place in the colonial world that they had fought to defend. Soldiers who had fought alongside European officers in Burma, who had seen Asian cities and traveled across continents and been asked to risk their lives for the freedom of others, came home to colonial systems that insisted nothing had changed and that they remained as they had always been. Historians have argued that this particular experience, fighting for a freedom they themselves did not possess, was a direct catalyst for the independence movements that swept across Africa in the 1950s and 1960s. The family separations of African soldiers during the war were therefore not only personal losses, they were, in a larger sense, the beginning of a political reckoning that would take a generation to arrive. Fact 60. For some families, the greatest cruelty was not the separation itself, but the administrative limbo of the missing. The specific, grinding experience of having a family member listed as missing with no confirmation in either direction. Families in this situation had no confirmed death, but they had no confirmed life either. They existed in a suspended state, unable to grieve fully and unable to stop hoping, which meant unable to grieve at all. In Britain, a soldier listed as missing was not legally presumed dead for 7 years under peacetime law, a rule that had to be adjusted after the war to allow families to move forward practically. Some families spent years unable to access pension entitlements, unable to remarry, unable to make decisions that a confirmed death would have permitted. The administrative uncertainty mapped precisely onto the emotional one, and the two reinforced each other in ways that could be genuinely paralyzing. Many women described it as the most disorienting aspect of the entire war, not the bombing, not the rationing, not even the fear, but the specific impossibility of knowing which kind of grief they were supposed to be living inside, and the exhaustion of holding both possibilities open simultaneously, year after year, with nothing to resolve them either way. Fact 61. The war produced an entire generation of children who knew their absent fathers almost entirely through objects. A framed photograph, a uniform kept folded in a wardrobe that was not to be touched, a handwriting style recognized before the envelope was opened, a medal in a drawer that everyone knew was there and no one quite discussed. These objects functioned as proxies for a relationship. Children studied the photograph for physical resemblance, ran their hands along a uniform's rough fabric, and assembled from those materials an imagined person who became real through the daily act of imagining them. When fathers finally returned, the living man had to compete, in a quiet and unspoken way, with the figure the child had carefully constructed from those objects over years of absence. The real person was always more complicated, more tired, more damaged, more purely human than the idealized version that the photograph had held so still and so perfectly. Some children made the adjustment naturally and without drama. Others found that the return of the real person disrupted something they had built and depended on, and the disappointment, never spoken because it made no acceptable sense, settled into the relationship. Some of those children remained faintly, inexplicably distant from their fathers for the rest of their lives without ever fully understanding the source of the distance. Fact 62. Not all wartime separations carried the same emotional weight, and one of the most significant variables was the degree of uncertainty about whether the absent person was even alive. A family waiting for a soldier in France in 1944, with Allied forces clearly advancing and the war clearly moving toward resolution, lived a different quality of waiting than a family whose son had disappeared into Japanese captivity in 1942 with nothing heard since. The latter families had years of absolute silence, no letters, no Red Cross confirmation, no official update of any kind. They did not know whether their person was in a labor camp, in a hospital, dead in an unmarked jungle grave, or somehow still surviving. They could not calibrate their fear to any known reality because there was no known reality to calibrate it to. Some prepared internally for a death that had not yet been officially confirmed. Others maintained hope across all 5 years on no evidence whatsoever. Both responses were entirely rational reactions to a situation that offered no rational footing. The difference between them was not access to information, because there was no information for either person to access, but temperament and the particular private architecture of how each person managed the impossible. Fact 63. The post-war rise in divorce was not simply about couples falling out of love during separation, though some of that certainly happened. For many couples, it reflected an honest recognition that both people had become genuinely, substantially different during the years apart, and that the marriage they were returning to was not quite the same marriage that the separation had interrupted. A woman who had managed a household alone for 5 years, raised children through bombing raids, worked in a factory, and made every significant decision in her life without consultation, had developed competencies and an independence that did not easily collapse back into a marriage built on earlier assumptions. A man who had survived extreme and unrepeatable experiences, things that could not be described, things that sat behind his eyes and did not leave, returned to civilian life carrying a weight that domestic routine was not designed to carry. Neither person was wrong. Neither had failed or chosen badly. They had each lived through 5 years of experiences that had nothing to do with the other, and the shared life they had built before the war had become, in the meantime, largely theoretical. The post-war adjustment asked two people who had each become someone new to love each other like the people they used to be. For many couples, that was simply more than was possible. Fact 64. Norwegian children born to Norwegian mothers and German fathers during the occupation, known as Krigsbarn or war children, experienced a family separation that came from both directions simultaneously. When the war ended and German forces withdrew, their fathers left with the retreating occupation, and the children remained behind with mothers who were now publicly shamed and legally penalized for their wartime relationships. Some of these children were institutionalized by the Norwegian state, which in some cases applied eugenic reasoning to classify them as potentially inferior and in need of management by the state rather than care by their mothers. They were separated not just from absent fathers, but from ordinary community life, and in some cases from their mothers, who could not protect them from state intervention even if they wanted to. They grew up without a coherent account of who they were or where they had come from, carrying a stigma that had nothing to do with any choice they had made. Norway did not formally acknowledge the mistreatment of these children until 2005, 6 decades after the events. By then, many of the Krigsbarn were elderly. The acknowledgement was real and meaningful, but it arrived at a point when most of the damage it might have addressed had already been done, and most of the lives it concerned were already nearly over. Fact 65. The BBC became the auditory anchor of separated families in Britain in a way that no other institution could quite replicate. The 6 short pips that preceded each news bulletin became a kind of conditioned response for listening families. People gathered at the radio at the sound of them because the broadcast that followed might contain a place name, a theatre of operations, a development that told them something, however oblique, about where a family member might be. The forces request programs, in which families sent dedications and messages to soldiers overseas, were among the most listened to broadcasts of the entire war, not because the music was exceptional, but because they carried the intentions of separated people toward each other across the distance, making the connection feel momentarily real. The radio was the technology that connected the private experience of individual family separation to the larger public story of the war, and listening to it was both a comfort and a sustained, unavoidable anxiety. Every bulletin brought the possibility of news that explained an absence, and also the possibility of news that made the absence permanent. Families learned to sit through broadcasts with a particular kind of controlled stillness, present, alert, and trying very hard not to form an expectation about what was coming before it arrived. Fact 66. Jewish children hidden during the occupation years under false identities faced a reunion challenge after the war that was unlike anything else anyone experienced. Many had spent years being someone else entirely, attending church, using a different name, speaking a different language, building genuine attachments to the families who had sheltered and protected them. When surviving relatives came to claim them after liberation, these children were often deeply, genuinely resistant to leaving the only stable home they had known during the years of the war. Legal disputes between biological relatives and wartime foster families occurred across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, and courts had to make impossible judgments, weighing a child's emotional welfare against the rights of surviving family members under the enormous pressure of the Holocaust's shadow. The children at the center of these cases were being asked to choose between a biological identity they barely remembered and a daily life that felt real and safe and theirs. Neither choice was clean. Children who returned to biological relatives sometimes spent years privately mourning the foster family they had been taken from. Children who remained with foster families sometimes spent years wondering about the relatives they had not gone with. The separation caused by the war did not end with reunion. It simply took on a different shape. Fact 67. Greek families separated by German occupation found that liberation in October 1944 did not bring them back together. It brought them directly into a civil war. Greece moved from Axis occupation to armed conflict between communist and royalist forces almost without pause, a war that lasted until 1949. Families that had been divided by the occupation were now divided by political allegiance, with members on each side of a new and bitter conflict. A family that had maintained contact through the years of occupation might find itself genuinely split by 1945. One son in the Communist Democratic Army, another serving with the government forces backed by Britain and the United States. These divisions were particularly sharp in Greece because the civil war was brutal and its casualties very high, and because the political identities forged during the resistance years were intense and deeply held. When the Civil War finally ended in 1949, the losing side faced imprisonment, exile, or permanent social exclusion. Some Greek families were separated by the consequences of the Civil War for an entire additional generation. The separation that began with the German invasion in 1941 extending through different forms and under different names until the 1970s or beyond. Fact 68. As the war turned against Germany and Allied bombing intensified through 1943 and 1944, German families that had held together through the earlier years of conflict were now split by the collapse of everything around them. Government-organized evacuations moved children first, then mothers with young children, then anyone who could be moved from the most vulnerable cities. Families that had maintained some form of togetherness through 4 years of war were now separated by the logistics of a losing war. Children in children's homes in the countryside, mothers in cities maintaining war production, fathers at fronts that were contracting on both sides. As the Red Army advanced from the east and Allied armies from the west, entire civilian populations were set in motion in mass, panicked flight. In that chaos, families lost each other on refugee roads, at river crossings overwhelmed by crowds, in bombing raids with no shelter close enough. Children ended up in orphanages or with strangers, giving their names and the names of their parents and having no idea whether anyone was looking for them or where looking might begin. The German state's own administrative infrastructure had collapsed under the pressure of total defeat. Families searching for each other after the war's final months had almost no official mechanism to help them, and the process of reassembling what the collapse had scattered lasted well into the 1950s. Fact 69. The expulsion of ethnic Germans from Eastern Europe after the war created one of the last great waves of wartime family separation. Between 1945 and 1950, an estimated 12 to 14 million ethnic Germans were removed from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia in processes that were frequently violent, chaotic, and entirely indifferent to the integrity of family units. Men were held back for forced labor, while women and children were expelled westward without them. Groups were separated at checkpoints and redirected to different destinations with no coordination between the officials managing the movements. Elderly people, unable to keep pace with the flow of evacuation, were sometimes simply left behind, separated from children and grandchildren who could not stop moving long enough to help them. Many of these separations were permanent. The person left behind died before they could be reached, or the political barriers forming between East and West made crossing back physically and legally impossible. The communities and extended family networks that had existed in Eastern Europe for generations were dismantled within a few years, and the people expelled from them arrived in a Germany that was technically their country but that felt, in every practical way, like somewhere they had never actually been from. They had homes in places that were no longer accessible, and they were home in a place they had never lived. Fact 70. The war's separations did not end with peace. For families divided by the Iron Curtain that descended across Europe by 1947, the geopolitical settlement of the post-war world created a new and indefinite form of separation, political rather than military, sustained by bureaucratic systems rather than by armies, but no less real in its effects on the people caught inside it. A Polish family with one member in the American zone of Germany and another in Soviet-controlled Poland faced barriers to reunion that no amount of personal determination could easily overcome. Some families separated in 1945 did not see each other again until the 1980s. Others never met again at all, separated by a political order that proved more durable than anyone had initially imagined, one that lasted in some cases until the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and in others beyond even that. The war ended on a specific date in May 1945. For these families, the separation it had caused continued under a different name, not war anymore, but politics, ideology, the apparatus of two hostile systems that did not want their citizens moving freely toward each other. The war ended. The distance it created did not. Fact 71. Soldiers who returned home carrying what we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, though it had no name and very little recognition then, brought with them a form of invisible separation that sat inside the reunion itself, making it simultaneously real and incomplete. These men were physically present. They sat at the table, slept in the bed, attended family events. But the part of them that had been in combat, the part that had seen things that could not be described to someone who hadn't been there, that had made decisions with no peacetime equivalent, that had survived losses still unprocessed, was not available in the ways that a returned husband or father needed to be available. Families described living alongside a man who was technically there but emotionally unreachable, who startled at loud sounds, who woke the household with nightmares, who looked through conversations rather than participating in them. Children who had waited years for their father's return found themselves living with a stranger who occupied their father's place, but seemed to have left the most essential parts of himself somewhere far away. The physical reunion resolved the geographical separation. The deeper distance remained, unnamed and untreated, sometimes for the rest of a man's life, running quietly beneath the surface of a family that everyone around them believed to be whole. Fact 72. The millions of letters exchanged between separated families during the war created an archive of human intimacy that historians are still, very slowly working their way through. These letters were written under specific constraints: censorship, the knowledge that they might be the last ones sent, the need to be simultaneously honest and reassuring. And those constraints shaped them into something remarkable. A soldier writing from the North African desert describing the quality of light at dusk was following censorship rules, maintaining his own connection to something beautiful, and giving his wife at home something real and specific to hold on to, all at the same time. A mother writing to an evacuated child about the neighbor's dog was managing her own loneliness, maintaining the child's sense of home, and performing a normalcy that may have cost her considerable daily effort. These letters are not just personal documents. They are records of how ordinary people used language under pressure, how much emotional intelligence lived in people who had never been asked to think of themselves as articulate, and how powerfully the need for human connection shapes the words people choose when the distance is great and the time for choosing is short. Fact 73. Canadian soldiers who spent years in Britain before the Normandy invasion found themselves in an unusual and psychologically complex form of separation. They were safer certainly than soldiers on the Eastern Front or deep in the Pacific, but they were doing nothing of immediate military consequence for years while their families waited at home without a clear answer to the question of when. The Canadian Army spent nearly 4 years in Britain training and waiting before seeing major combat, and the soldiers' letters home during that period had to manage the particular difficulty of justifying continued absence without being able to explain it. Wives and parents in Canada knew only that their person was alive and in England, and that the war was continuing, with no resolution date visible. The waiting on the Canadian home front was therefore a specific kind, not the acute fear of someone in immediate danger, but the dull, sustained uncertainty of an open-ended absence that seemed to have no end. When the Normandy invasion finally came in June 1944, and the news turned to real battles and real casualty lists, some Canadian families described a strange and uncomfortable relief, not happiness, but the feeling that at least something was now happening, even as they understood what that meant for the person they were waiting for. Fact 74. The children of the war, those old enough to remember it and young enough to be lastingly shaped by it, grew into adults who carried it inside them in ways that were not always visible or acknowledged by the culture around them. Research conducted from the 1970s onward found elevated rates of anxiety, attachment difficulties, and emotional suppression in this generation that correlated clearly with wartime separation and disruption. Many had never spoken at any length about their wartime childhood, partly because the cultural message of the post-war decades was to move forward rather than look back, and partly because children's experiences during the war were not considered historically significant in the way that soldiers' experiences were. They were survivors of something, but the something didn't have a recognized name, and no one was formally asking about it. It was only when researchers began specifically asking this generation what they remembered and how they felt about it that the full depth of the wartime childhood experience became visible. What emerged was not simply a story of resilience. The resilience was real, but a more complicated account of endurance that had costs, of adaptation that left marks, and of the specific and lasting ways that prolonged family separation during the most formative years of a life reshapes the person that child eventually becomes. Fact 75. The post-war world was built partly around the desire to prevent the separations the war had caused from ever happening on that scale again. The founding of the United Nations, the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, the establishment of UNICEF for the protection of children, all were shaped in part by the specific human costs that the war had made impossible to look away from. The clause in the Universal Declaration stating that the family is the natural and fundamental group unit of society, deserving of protection by society and the state, was not an abstract philosophical position arrived at through discussion. It was a direct response to the documented, witnessed, lived reality of what happened when states and wars dismantled families without protection or recourse, and left no institution responsible for the consequences. The generation of people who wrote those documents had mostly lived through the separations themselves. They knew, in a personal and indelible way, what was at stake. The institutions they built were imperfect and remain contested, but their root was real. It was the memory of a platform, a letter, a photograph kept on a mantelpiece, and a child waiting for a particular door to open. Fact 76. Australian families waiting for news from Singapore after February 1942 lived inside one of the most prolonged and complete information blackouts experienced by any Allied civilian population during the war. When 15,000 Australian soldiers surrendered with the fall of Singapore, the Japanese military provided almost no prisoner information to the Red Cross or to Allied governments. Australian wives and mothers received a single notification that their husband or son had been taken prisoner and then, in many cases, heard nothing further for years. No letters, no Red Cross confirmation of health or location, no camp name, no list. Some families received their first real news when prisoners were moved to the Burma-Thailand Railway in 1943, and that news came not through official channels but through escaped prisoners, returned wounded soldiers, or neutral intermediaries. The railway killed approximately 13,000 Allied prisoners during its construction. Families in Australia therefore spent years not knowing whether their person was alive, or building the railway, or recovering from it, or buried in jungle soil on the other side of the world. The silence lasted, in some cases, until liberation in August 1945. 3.5 years of unbroken official nothing. Some families came through it and found their person alive. Others came through it and learned exactly how long they had been grieving without permission. Fact 77. The act of keeping a family photograph safe became, for many soldiers, one of the small but significant rituals of wartime survival, something that mattered more than its physical size would suggest. Photographs were carried in breast pockets, tucked inside identity documents, folded carefully and unfolded carefully again. They were shown to other soldiers in moments of quiet. Here is my wife, here are my children, here is the house. The photograph served several psychological functions at once. It was evidence that another life existed, that it was real and not imagined or remembered incorrectly. It was a reason to be careful, to survive, to keep making the choices that kept the path home open. It was also a form of connection that required no language and no correspondence. A face that could be looked at directly, that looked back. Soldiers who lost their photographs in combat, or in the chaos of retreat, described the loss as disproportionately painful, out of all proportion to the physical object. What they had lost was not paper and chemicals, but the daily visual reassurance that the person was still there, still real, still waiting, still the reason the war had a point beyond its own continuation. The photograph was the war's most personal object. It was carried closer to the body than any weapon. Fact 78. Polish families separated by the Soviet deportations of 1940 and 1941 endured one of the most geographically extreme forms of wartime separation that the conflict produced. Between 300,000 and 1 million Polish citizens were loaded into cattle cars and transported to Siberia, Kazakhstan, and other remote regions of the Soviet Union in 4 major deportation waves. The journeys lasted weeks in freezing conditions with minimal food and almost no water. Families were often separated in the process. Men taken separately to labor camps, while women and children were sent to special settlements in areas so remote they had barely been named. Children arrived in places they could not find on any map they had ever seen, in temperatures they had never experienced, surrounded by people speaking a language they did not know. Those who survived the first winter, and many did not, began the slow and almost incomprehensible process of constructing some form of daily life in conditions of extreme deprivation. Some of these people did not return to Poland for 15 years. Some never returned at all. The separation from everything familiar was so total that some survivors described it not as displacement, but as erasure, not being moved somewhere, but being removed from existence as they had known it, and then left to begin again from the ground up, in the cold, with nothing. Fact 79. For the families of men killed in action, the separation resolved itself eventually into grief. But the grief was complicated by the circumstances of wartime death in ways that peacetime loss rarely is. Many soldiers died far from home, in places their families could not visit, under circumstances their families could not imagine, among people their families had never met. The body was frequently not repatriated. It was buried where the soldier fell, in a military cemetery that the family might spend decades saving money to visit. Some soldiers had no known grave at all. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission lists over 200,000 names on memorials to the missing, men whose bodies were never recovered or positively identified. For the families of these men, the grief had no physical anchor. There was no grave to stand at, no place where the person demonstrably was. The loss existed only as an absence, in the empty chair, the unreturned letter, the name on a stone wall among thousands of other names, each one representing a family that was still, in some essential way, waiting. The wall gave them somewhere to go. It gave the absence a fixed address, but it could not give them the thing they had actually come for. Fact 80. The children who grew up in displaced persons camps after the war occupied a particularly uncertain space between the world they had come from and the world they might eventually reach. These camps, established across Germany and Austria to house the millions displaced by the conflict, were meant as temporary facilities. Many became semi-permanent communities, housing hundreds of thousands of people for years. Children born in or brought to these camps in 1945 were sometimes still living in them in 1948 or 1949, growing up in a liminal world between the country that had persecuted or expelled their families and the countries that had not yet agreed to take them in. For Jewish children in particular, the displaced persons camps were places of collective grief and collective determination running side by side. Communities rebuilding their social fabric in provisional conditions, running schools, newspapers, and cultural organizations in the absence of anything permanent to build on. These children grew up with a community around them instead of a stable family in many cases, surrounded by adults who were all, in different ways and to different degrees, still searching for something they had lost. The camps produced a generation shaped by displacement, by loss, and by the particular resilience that comes from having nothing fixed to depend on except the people immediately around you. Fact 81. The wartime experience of separated families was shaped significantly by economic class and by the resources families had available to manage the separation. Wealthy families had more options across the board. Private evacuation arrangements that placed children with known relatives or trusted family friends rather than strangers assigned through an official scheme. The financial ability to travel and visit evacuated children, the resources to maintain a steady correspondence and send parcels. Working-class families had far less of everything. Their children were placed through the official evacuation program with whoever had registered as a host, which meant the quality of the placement was unpredictable and entirely outside the family's control. Their ability to visit was limited by train fares and shift work schedules that left no time to spare. Their letters were written on whatever paper was available and posted with whatever money could be found. The same war produced radically different experiences of separation depending on what resources a family could bring to managing it. This disparity was felt by the people living through it. The wartime rhetoric of shared sacrifice and collective suffering was real in some respects. The bombs did not discriminate, but the capacity to protect one's family from the consequences of those bombs was very unevenly distributed, and the families with the least were consistently asked to bear the most. Fact 82. Families separated by the Pacific War faced separations measured not just in distance but in near total ignorance of conditions. The Pacific theater stretched across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle, and the realities of fighting in New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, or Iwo Jima were so remote from anything in civilian life that families at home had almost no framework for imagining what their person was living through. Soldiers' letters from the Pacific were censored to remove any location information, and the military's public descriptions of the theater filtered everything through a lens of heroism that obscured the particular and brutal nature of the fighting. Families waited in a specific imaginative vacuum, knowing their person was somewhere in the Pacific, knowing the Pacific was vast and the fighting was brutal, but unable to picture anything specific. When soldiers returned from the Pacific, the gap between what they had actually experienced and what their families had been able to imagine was often immense, and it made the process of reintegration genuinely difficult. The family had been waiting for someone they could picture. The person who walked through the door had lived through things that had no domestic equivalent and no easy translation, and the distance between those two realities was not always possible to close. Fact 83. The reunion of mothers and evacuated children in 1945 was made complicated by how much both had changed during the years of separation, and by how little support either was offered in navigating the gap. Children who had been sent away at 6 or 7 years old returned at 11 or 12, having spent the majority of their conscious childhood in someone else's house, in a different part of the country, shaped by different adults. Some returned to mothers they felt they barely knew. The relationship had been sustained through letters and occasional visits, but the daily intimacy of actually living together had been absent for years. Mothers had changed equally. They had managed entirely alone, made every decision themselves, built a daily life structured around their own rhythms, and in many cases worked outside the home for the first time. The return of a child who was now almost a teenager, with habits and preferences formed elsewhere, required real adjustment on both sides. Some reunions were warm and relatively smooth. Others were stilted and careful, requiring months of patient daily rebuilding before the relationship felt natural again. The British government, focused on physical reconstruction and economic recovery, provided almost no support for the psychological dimension of these reunions. Families were expected to simply pick up where they had left off, as though the years between had not happened, as though both people were still who they had been the last time they were in the same room. Fact 84. The experience of families in Leningrad during the 872-day siege represented an extreme form of separation in which the city itself was the prison. The siege, which began in September 1941 and ended in January 1944, cut Leningrad off from the rest of the Soviet Union almost completely. Families whose members happened to be outside the city when the encirclement closed, soldiers already at the front, relatives who had traveled for other reasons, were separated from those inside by a front line that was essentially impassable. Inside the city, families were also separated by death on a massive scale over months and years. The bread ration fell to 125 grams per day in the worst period of the winter of 1941 to 1942. A piece of bread roughly the size of a clenched fist for the entire day. Approximately 1 million civilians died during the siege, the majority from starvation. Families lost members one by one across the long winter months, often unable to arrange burials in frozen ground, often too physically weakened to carry a body far. Survivors described the specific loneliness of being the last one remaining in a household that had held 4 or 5 people. The silence of rooms that had been full, the names no longer spoken because there was no one left to speak them to. Fact 85. The wartime experience permanently altered the way many people understood what a family actually was, what held it together, and what, at the core, it consisted of. Before the war, family was a physical reality. People who occupied shared space, ate at the same table, moved through the same house. The war demonstrated, at enormous cost, that a family could also exist as a purely relational thing. People connected by love and memory and correspondence across distances that made physical presence impossible for years at a time. This was not a comfortable lesson to learn. It arrived wrapped in loss and fear and sustained uncertainty, but many of the people who lived through it described emerging from the war with a clarity about what actually mattered in a family. Not the house, not the routines, not the shared meals, but the specific and irreplaceable presence of particular people who could not be substituted. The loss of those people, through death or displacement, or the permanent alteration that trauma produced, was a loss that no amount of reconstruction could fully address. The war rebuilt cities, it rebuilt economies, it built international institutions designed to prevent the next war. What it could not rebuild, in every case, was the exact configuration of people who had stood together on a platform before the train came, and who had believed, because nothing had yet suggested otherwise, that they would all be standing there again soon. Fact 86. Soviet families separated by the war faced an additional layer of fear that Western families largely did not: the fear of their own state. A family whose husband or son had been taken prisoner by German forces was not simply worried about his physical survival. They were also aware that the Soviet state considered capture a form of potential betrayal, and that a prisoner who returned alive might be arrested rather than welcomed home. Some wives concealed their husband's prisoner status entirely, describing him as missing or dead rather than as a prisoner of war, to avoid the stigma and official attention that prisoner status carried. Children of prisoners learned not to mention their fathers at school. The surveillance and ideological pressure of the Stalinist system added a layer of domestic secrecy to an already painful situation, requiring families to perform a version of normal life while carefully concealing the reality of their circumstances from neighbors, officials, and sometimes even from extended family members who might inadvertently say the wrong thing to the wrong person. This double existence, private grief behind a public performance of normalcy, was its own specific and exhausting form of separation. The person was missing, and the missing person had to be kept missing in the right direction. Fact 87. The wartime experience of separation produced lasting changes in how people approached the practical organization of family life in the decades that followed. After the war, families across Britain, the United States, and Western Europe placed a new and very deliberate premium on home ownership, on geographic stability, and on keeping the family physically together in one place. The post-war suburban expansion, the rapid growth of owner-occupied housing in the late 1940s and 1950s, was driven partly by economics and government policy, but also by a deeply felt desire, rooted directly in wartime experience, to have a fixed address that belonged to you and could not be taken away by someone else's decision. The generation that had been evacuated, displaced, or separated did not want to be moved again. They wanted walls, a garden, a mortgage, a front door that was specifically theirs. The desire for rootedness that shaped post-war domestic culture was not simply materialism, though it could look like that from the outside. It was the physical expression of a lesson the war had delivered with great force, that home was not guaranteed, that the people in it could be scattered in days, and that building something as solid and permanent as possible was not comfort-seeking but reasonable, informed, earned caution. Fact 88. The children of soldiers who did not come back, who were killed in action or died in captivity, grew up shaped by a specific kind of permanent absence with no resolution and no endpoint. There was no reunion to wait for. The father was not coming. But the absence remained present in the household in particular ways. The mother's grief, which children absorbed without fully understanding it. The social identity of being a war orphan. The gap in the family's economic position that a father's death created. The specific psychological challenge of building an identity partly around a person you had never known or barely remembered. Research conducted from the 1980s onward found patterns of idealization. Fathers who had died young in difficult circumstances became figures of almost mythological proportion in their children's minds. The mythology made normal grief difficult, because you cannot grieve a myth the way you grieve a person. Some of these children spent their adult lives searching for information, not just facts about where their father had been and what had happened to him, but the texture of a personality, the sound of a laugh, the small and particular human details that official records never contain, and that only people who knew him would know. Fact 89. The wartime separation of families in China lasted longer than anywhere else in the world, and its effects extended further into the 20th century than any comparable disruption. China had been at war since 1937, and in some regions since the early 1930s, meaning that families in severely affected areas lived through a decade or more of conflict, displacement, and rupture. Spans of time long enough to define not just individual lives but entire generational outlooks. Families split along lines of flight. Those who escaped westward to Chongqing and those left behind in occupied cities. Those in the nationalist army and those with communist forces. Those who survived occupation and those who did not. The civil war that resumed immediately after Japan's surrender in 1945 deepened these separations, and the communist victory in 1949 and the division between mainland China and Taiwan created political barriers that held for decades. For some Chinese families, the separation that began with the Japanese invasion in 1937 was not resolved until the 1980s or later. A sibling left on one side of the Taiwan Strait in 1949, a father conscripted and lost in the Civil War, a family member who had taken a different road in a particular city in a particular month. These became permanent absences, long enough to outlast the people who had originally been separated. passing their unresolved weight to the next generation and the next. Fact 90. The specific grief of mothers who had sent their children away on the Kindertransport and who were subsequently killed in the Holocaust was documented after the war largely through the testimonies of the surviving children, because those mothers left almost no other record. What the testimonies describe are final letters, sometimes arriving weeks or months after the parents had already been deported, that spoke of ordinary things: the weather, neighbors, small, specific hopes for the future expressed in careful, present tense sentences. Parents writing from ghettos or transit camps wrote to children in England without describing where they were or what was happening around them. They kept their letters the same. The children received these letters and could not have known, when they read them, that the person writing was already unreachable, that the ordinary life described in the letter was already gone or had never quite existed as described. Reading those letters decades later, the Kindertransport survivors described holding something that was simultaneously an act of love and an act of protective concealment. Their parents had shielded them from the full truth, even at the end. That protection, given at such cost, was itself a form of the parents' continued presence, arriving through the post long after the person had gone, still doing what a parent does, keeping the child as safe as they possibly can. Fact 91. The wartime generation's reluctance to speak about what they had lived through shaped the emotional atmosphere of households across the post-war decades in ways that were pervasive but rarely named. Children who grew up in the 1950s and 1960s frequently described homes where large things were simply never discussed, where a father's nightmares were not mentioned, where a mother's wartime loneliness had no acknowledged history, where the dead were referenced obliquely or not at all, and where the war was treated as a chapter that was finished and therefore closed. This silence was not indifference. It was the result of people who had endured extreme things choosing, deliberately or instinctively, to prioritize the present over the past, protecting their children from history while simultaneously transmitting its weight through the atmosphere of the household, through the things that were not said and the subjects that were not approached. Researchers who studied this intergenerational transmission found that the children of the wartime generation often carried anxieties they could not source, fears about separation, about the sudden disruption of ordinary life, about the fragility of security, that made complete sense as inheritances, but had no explanation that had ever been offered. The silence did not protect the next generation from the war's effects. It simply removed the context. Fact 92. The wartime letters that passed between separated couples carried, in many cases, an entire relationship that existed only on paper. Couples who had married quickly before deployment, and many did, since wartime accelerated every kind of intimate decision, sometimes spent far more of their early married life writing to each other than they had spent actually sharing daily existence. Their knowledge of each other was constructed through correspondence, the preferences revealed in how things were described, the personality that came through in sentence construction, the intimacy built through the discipline of saying something real within the constraints of censorship and distance, and the knowledge that the letter might be read by strangers before it reached the person it was meant for. When these couples were finally reunited, the person who walked through the door was meeting, in a very real sense, a correspondent rather than a companion, someone they knew deeply in one register and barely at all in another. The transition from a paper relationship to a daily one required an adjustment that some couples navigated naturally and well, and others found impossible. Both outcomes made complete sense. They had each been building a relationship with a version of the other person that letters could hold. The actual person was larger than any letter, and messier, and real in ways that paper could only approximate. Fact 93. The network of women who ran households, raised children, maintained correspondence, and managed the sustained emotional weight of uncertainty through the war years were performing, by any honest measure, one of the most demanding roles of the entire conflict. The public understanding of women's wartime contribution focused on factory work, nursing, and auxiliary military service, all real, all significant. What went largely unacknowledged was the domestic labor of holding families together across separation, the letters written after children were in bed, the management of children's fear, the maintenance of routines through bombing, the years of sustained uncertainty borne without complaint and without an audience. This work was invisible as work because it had always been invisible as work. It was understood as simply what women did, the background against which everything else took place. After the war, many of these women were encouraged to leave paid employment and return to domestic roles that were framed publicly as a relief and a reward. For women who had spent years managing everything alone, the return was often experienced as a contraction, a narrowing of a self that had expanded considerably under the pressure of necessity, and that did not easily compress again just because the reason for the expansion was officially over. Fact 94. The physical reunion of a family at the war's end was always only the beginning of a longer, less visible, and largely unsupported process. The geographical separation ended on a specific day. The soldier came through the door, the evacuee returned, the prisoner was released. But the psychological distance that had accumulated across years of separate experience did not close on that day. It closed, when it closed, through the gradual and patient accumulation of shared daily moments. Meals and conversations and arguments and routines rebuilt together from almost nothing. This process took months in the best cases, and years in the harder ones. Some families never fully closed the distance. Some husbands and wives lived out their marriages in a cordial but fundamental separateness. Two people in the same house who had each become, during the war, someone the other did not entirely know. Their children grew up inside that contained distance without understanding its source. It was only much later, sometimes a generation later, when the wartime cohort began to speak, or when they died and left letters and diaries behind, that the full shape of what the separation had done to the people who survived it became visible and could finally be named. Fact 95. The wartime experience of families in Malta is a concentrated example of how sustained external threat reshapes domestic life entirely, and of how a civilian population can endure things that have no precedent. Malta endured approximately 3,000 air raids over 2.5 years of siege and bombardment, more bombing per square mile than any other place on Earth during the entire war. Families on the island lived in the same houses throughout, unable to evacuate because there was simply nowhere to go. The separation here was not geographic. Families remained together physically, but it was a separation from safety, from normalcy, from any version of daily life that did not include the possibility of sudden death arriving from the sky without warning. Children grew up knowing the network of tunnels and underground shelters beneath the island's limestone surface better than they knew the streets above. Families developed routines organized entirely around the threat, where to run, how fast, who picked up the youngest child. The George Cross awarded to Malta in April 1942 was addressed to the island's population collectively, a rare and significant acknowledgement that an entire community of ordinary people, families, neighbors, an island, had endured something together that deserved recognition as a form of collective courage, even though no one had chosen it. Fact 96. For many families, the end of the war revealed the full extent of losses that the years of uncertainty had kept partially hidden from view. Families who had spent years not knowing were now told. The Red Cross tracing service delivered confirmations. Displaced persons camps posted lists. Repatriated prisoners brought news of those who had not come back with them. The weeks and months following the end of hostilities in Europe and the Pacific were, for a significant number of families, not a period of uncomplicated celebration, but of belated, concentrated, and entirely private grief. The public celebrations of VE Day and VJ Day were genuine. The relief was real and the joy was real. But they were celebrations that existed alongside private moments in quiet rooms where people were receiving at last the information they had been waiting years to get, and the information was not good. A woman dancing in the street on VE Day and a woman at home receiving a Red Cross notification were both responding to the same event, the war's end. The gap between those two experiences of the same day was one of the quieter truths of that time, and it was one that many families carried privately with great care for the rest of their lives. Fact 97. The question of what to tell children about absent or dead fathers occupied mothers throughout the wartime and post-war years in ways that had no clear answer and no established guidance. Mothers whose husbands were serving in the military managed their children's anxiety by keeping information partial, enough to explain the absence without enough to produce unmanageable fear. Mothers whose husbands had been killed faced the harder task of explaining a permanent absence to children of different ages simultaneously, without any cultural script to follow for wartime bereavement. Some idealized the dead father to the point where the ideal became a weight for the child, an impossible standard attached to a person who existed only in memory and who therefore never had the opportunity to be ordinarily, humanly imperfect. Others suppressed the subject so completely that children grew up with almost no information about a parent who had been central to the family's formation. Neither approach was wrong exactly. Both were attempts made under enormous pressure to protect children from a reality that was too large and too sharp to hand over whole. Both left marks, different marks on different children that showed up in different ways and at different times, but marks that were there nevertheless. Fact 98. The wartime experience of families in Japan was shaped by the particular nature of Japanese military culture and the catastrophic turn the Pacific War took for Japan in its final years. Japanese soldiers did not write openly to their families about fear, doubt, or the physical reality of combat. The cultural and military expectation was one of stoic dedication to duty, and letters home reflected that expectation rather than the full truth of what was happening. Families received letters that were, in a sense, performances of the ideal soldier rather than communications from a specific, frightened, exhausted human being. As the war turned decisively against Japan and the island campaigns produced catastrophic casualties, the letters became shorter and more formulaic. Many families received a final letter that gave no indication it was final, followed by a terse official notification of death with minimal detail. The gap between the managed correspondence and the actual experience was enormous, and many Japanese families spent decades after the war trying to find out what had really happened to their person, not just the official facts of where and when he died, but who he had actually been at the end, what he had actually felt, whether the composure the letters described had been real, or whether, underneath it, there had been something else entirely. Fact 99. The wartime separation of families was, at its deepest level, a rupture in the ordinary fabric of shared experience, and what made it so lastingly damaging was not only the absence of the person, but the impossibility of sharing with them the experiences that most needed sharing. A mother watching her city burn during a bombing raid could not tell her husband, somewhere in North Africa, what it had looked and sounded and smelled like. A soldier who had survived a battle that had killed half the people around him could not describe it in a letter that would pass a censor and still make sense on the other side. The experiences that were most urgent, most defining, most in need of being witnessed by someone who knew and loved you, those were precisely the experiences that could not be shared across the distance. Human intimacy is built partly through the act of sharing experience, saying this happened to me and having someone understand it because they were there, or because they know you well enough to imagine it accurately. The war systematically prevented that sharing for years, and the accumulation of unshared experience on both sides of the separation produced a gulf that was real and persistent, and that often outlasted the separation itself by years. Fact 100. The generation born immediately after the war, the baby boom generation, born in greatest numbers between 1946 and 1964, was the direct and physical consequence of families finally being put back together. In Britain, the birth rate rose sharply in 1946, as returned soldiers and their wives began the life they had been waiting to live. In the United States, the pattern was similar, and across Western Europe, the post-war years brought a surge in births that reflected both years of pent-up desire and the deliberate, conscious decision of reunited couples to build the family that the war had delayed. These children grew up in households shaped by the war's separations without having directly experienced them. They were raised by parents who valued stability with an intensity that might have seemed excessive without context, who did not speak easily about the past, who placed enormous weight on keeping the family physically together, and who expressed their love partly through the provision of security, houses, stability, fixed addresses, a front door that was theirs. The baby boom generation inherited the world its parents had built out of the ruins of separation. What took time to understand was that it had also inherited the silence around everything that had made that world necessary. The quiet, held knowledge of how easily ordinary life can be taken apart and how long it takes to put back together. Fact 101. The last fact is perhaps the simplest one, and in some ways the most important. Across every country, every front, every theater of the entire war, the most common thing that separated families did was wait. They waited for letters, they waited for news. They waited at railway stations, in ports, in doorways, at windows overlooking streets they had been watching for years. They waited through silence and through uncertainty and through the slow, unmarked passage of years that had no guaranteed end. And while they waited, they kept going, feeding children, maintaining households, doing the ordinary things that daily life requires, even when the larger context makes ordinary life feel thin and provisional and held together with effort rather than ease. The waiting was not passive. It was an active, sustained act of will, the decision made again each morning to keep the structure of life intact until the person came back to live inside it again. Some people waited for someone who came back whole, some for someone who came back changed, some for someone who did not come back at all. But the waiting itself, the maintenance of hope, the keeping of a place at the table, the letters sent into uncertainty, the photographs held in the dark, was a form of love that asked nothing in return. It deserves to be understood as exactly what it was: remarkable, ordinary, and very human. The whole story really comes down to one thing: people waiting. That's it. Waiting for a letter, waiting for a knock at the door, waiting for a name on a list, waiting for someone to come through a gate, or step off a train, or simply appear at the end of a street that had been empty for too long, and doing all of that waiting while simultaneously keeping a household running, raising children, going to work, pretending to be fine. What makes it heavy is how long it lasted. This wasn't a few weeks of ordinary worry. Some families went 3, 4, 5 years without reliable news of someone they loved. Japanese captivity meant complete silence, no letters, no confirmation of any kind, nothing. Soviet families carried the additional weight of a state that treated their missing husbands as potential suspects. Polish families were deported to Siberia and lost track of each other in the chaos of cattle cars and frozen settlements. Jewish families put their children on trains and never saw them again. Each situation had its own particular version of the same unbearable uncertainty, the same open-ended not knowing that had no polite resolution. And then the war ended, and everyone hoped that reunion would simply fix it. It didn't, not cleanly, not quickly. The father who came home was not always the father who had left. The child who returned from evacuation was not the child who had been sent away. Both people had lived through years of experiences the other had no access to, and the closing of that gap took far longer than anyone was prepared for. Sometimes it never fully closed at all. That is what this topic is really about. Not the battles, not the strategy, not the sweep of history, just the gap between the people who left and the people who waited, and what it cost both sides to find their way back to each other. And the quiet truth that in most cases, not all, but most, they did. As you rest now, let these facts settle gently around you. They ask nothing of you except to be here, warm and still and breathing quietly. There is no lesson to extract, no conclusion you need to reach, only the soft, distant observation that human beings have endured enormous things and kept going, that families have been scattered and have found each other again, that love stretched across impossible distances and in many cases held. Let the stories blur together now, the letters, the platforms, the photographs, the waiting. Let them merge into a general, soft warmth. The specific facts fade. What remains is something quieter, the knowledge that hard things end, that people manage, that mornings keep arriving. Your breathing is slow and easy. The room is still. Whatever is unresolved in your own life will still be there tomorrow, patient and manageable. Tonight, there is only rest, deep, unhurried, completely deserved rest. You have done enough today. The day is finished. The stories are told, and sleep is here now. Not late, not early, but exactly when it should be, carrying you gently down into the quiet darkness where nothing is required of you and everything is well. Good night. Sleep deeply. Sleep well. All is settled. All is still. All is exactly as it should be. Good night.